March 11th, 2014. It wasn't but a few months before this that I'd finally finished Demon Souls for the first time. Though my initial attempts were way back in January of 2011, it would be several years before I would really get the Souls formula. The games were demanding but rewarding. After finally finishing the first in the series, I was dying to play the other two games. Dark Souls 2 was released that very day, and I'd been following news from the beta rapidly. A friend of mine decided to stop by after I'd recently shown him some of what Demon Souls had to offer. At his arrival, I was delighted to find that he'd bought both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 on his way over. We put the first game in and proceeded to spend the next 7 hours straight dying over and over. We'd take turns at each death, which to this day I still believe is the best way to play a new Souls title. After all that time, we'd only managed to make it to the Bell Gargoyles, a feat both of us could easily accomplish without any deaths in under 15 minutes today. This was my first experience with Dark Souls, and after all this time, I'm delighted to say that this game still holds up as well as it did back then. It has a few more problems than I'd noticed in 2014, and it has a few major issues that I recognized as such even on my initial experience with it. But there's nothing quite like this game, even with its predecessor and successors. Replaying Demon Souls recently and being disappointed with a lot of its structural weaknesses, I'm relieved Dark Souls 1 holds up much better. Before we step into the critique, there are a few concepts I think it's important that we discuss. These are things I've expounded upon before, but my understanding of them stems from this very game. As such, they're integral to understanding why this game has the reputation it does, and also why it's so strong in so many of its design choices. First is the concept of language of play, or the idea that each game speaks a certain language of its own through its rules, aesthetics, and mechanics, which when in harmony create a stronger potential experience. But it's important to also be aware of the fact that the language a game speaks can also be a barrier to entry. Back when Souls really started blowing up, some of you might be surprised to know that there was definitely a divide between those that thought it was clever to the point of brilliance, and those who believed it was a mess of purposefully hostile design that was structured to rope in and entertain masochists. While most players and the industry at large believe Souls has awakened something special within games today, there are still a few that think it's all poorly designed, but those numbers were much bigger back when the series was still fresh. I think the reason for this is how different its language of play was from the action games and RPGs we were used to. The prevailing trope at the time was that of an extreme player power fantasy, where you were the master of your destiny. The world revolved around your actions, and the only thing stopping you from dominating any foe was your willingness to engage. Dark Souls stepped away from this both thematically and mechanically. Games like Kingdom Hearts or Devil May Cry had trained people for over a decade that you could be fairly reckless in your pursuit of success. Not only were Sora and Dante extremely confident as characters and absolutely spoiled in their combat options, but enemies were dumb, slow, and extremely weak compared to our heroes. Meanwhile, we had the ability to dash around battle stages at lightning speed, blocking or dodging any attack with next to nothing in the form of repercussions. Attacks came out in less than half a second and could usually be cancelled into other actions, making sure you never left an opening for your enemies. Never was a one-on-one fight even close to a threat, and often the only thing that could pose any real danger was a dozen or more enemies and a higher difficulty setting. And even then, near-endless stores of healing items and grinding for levels were often available options to brute force your way through everything. Dark Souls does none of this. In Dark Souls, it's rare that an appropriately equipped new player isn't level with or even less powerful than just a single basic enemy, and bosses tower over you in power. The world doesn't care about you in Souls. Your character exudes no personality without your input, meaning if you're timid, they'll do nothing to instill you with confidence. Attacks are usually slow, and once you start an action, you have to commit. Canceling an action is not but a pipe dream. Healing items are limited, and the game doesn't shower you with options. You pick a path and you slowly specialize, unlike its genre predecessors, where your arsenal usually expanded over time. Arguably most brutal of all in terms of perception of difficulty, you can't tone it down with a slider or difficulty selection option. Souls can only be made significantly easier through experience, enormous amounts of grinding, or cheating. Despite all of this though, Souls strives to always be fair, and Dark Souls 1 arguably nails this better than any of the other games in the series, despite some serious late game missteps. And that's what's so hard for people to grasp, is that Souls is fair, rather than being tilted in your favor like most other games that preceded it. These games were unfair, they were just unfair in your favor. In order to understand Souls, you first have to learn its language, something the game doesn't always do the best job of teaching, as we'll get into later. But regardless, that to me is the biggest hurdle for players, is learning to put old habits aside and play this game like it wants to be played. It's no more Dark Souls' fault if you try to ignore its rules than it is baseball's fault if you don't try to play by its rules. I truly think this disconnect between Souls design and the design of other action games is what leads to the biggest struggle. Souls titles aren't actually that difficult, and I don't mean that to be demeaning to those who have a hard time with them. We all did at one point, and anyone who says otherwise is more than likely lying. They're not easy games, I just don't think they're that challenging. I would argue the biggest area of challenge is that Souls so evenly distributes power between the game and the player, rather than making the player overpowered. But there are a lot of other games that do this in different ways. Regardless, the biggest roadblock that makes it seem so difficult is that it's difficult to learn, just like a language or an instrument. Because of this, it's a lack of patience in players that seems to be the largest cause of death. Watch a newer player try the game after you've grown comfortable with it, and you'll notice how often they try to take a risk and just get one extra hit in or whatever, or don't pay enough attention to the other enemies outside of the one they're locked onto, etc. They make risky decisions because they've been conditioned to believe they can get away with them. With this in mind, I actually believe the "get good" motto of the series is kind of too vague. "Don't get greedy" really does fit the game a lot better. Because it's true, a lot of your problems in Souls can be managed way easier if you just resist the urge to be greedy. When I watch newer Souls players, the feeling I most regularly feel is the tension that comes from the often insane risks they take. And yet, they seem completely calm in taking said risk, which indicates that they don't understand just how likely they are to get punished for what they just did. At the same time though, their play looks both confused and sluggish. Likewise, if you watch a seasoned Souls player, a lot of what they do will look unthinkably crazy and risky, but in reality, a lot of these actions are actually significantly safer than the options the new player took in that same situation. This indicates a disconnect between what you see and what you know, which illustrates rather well why it's important to first learn how Souls wants you to play. The other core aspect to Souls design I want to touch on is the concept of universal mechanics versus optional mechanics. This series thrives on delicately balancing between these two types of mechanics, which is what gives it such a varied set of player options, while still universally challenging players on a few select ideas. I think this is the most important thing about Souls that makes it so great. I've wondered for years what the best way to illustrate the difference between these is, and I think I've finally found it. Spelunky. Spelunky perfectly separates its universal mechanics from its optional mechanics, as do most roguelikes honestly. In Spelunky, every game sees the player at square one, with nothing more than access to their universal abilities and then 4 bombs and 4 ropes. In order to be fair, Spelunky had to be designed to be completable with nothing but your universal abilities, those being jump, your run, your ability to pick things up and throw them, and your whip. No matter what, you will always start with infinite uses of all of these abilities. For all intents and purposes, they are permanent, hence being universal mechanics. Likewise, every other ability in Spelunky is randomized and therefore optional. You may end up with a shotgun or without, with tons of bombs or running out of them before the first stage, with climbing gloves, a camera, spiked boots, and a cape, or with nothing at all. As such, the game has to, at its core, be structured to require none of these abilities at any point to progress, because forcing players to give up since they don't have a jetpack or something would be insanely unfair. But it goes a step further than this, because that's only half of the design battle. A game structured like this will work, sure, but it can also end up so lopsided in terms of ability priority that none of the optional mechanics you may come across are worth utilizing. A lot of games honestly fall into this trap, even games like Kingdom Hearts, where you're guaranteed access to nearly every ability. So, what makes Spelunky truly great is the fact that each of these optional mechanics comes with very real benefits that can't be found in the universal abilities. They also importantly come with downsides that make them interesting to play around, but the key is that they afford the player unique benefits they can't find anywhere else. This not only means that every playthrough is different, but it also means they'll all have a unique ebb and flow, where certain challenges are harder because of the abilities you've picked up along the way, and others will be easier. This is also what I would argue is Dark Souls' strongest asset. Dark Souls isn't always supposed to be at the same level of challenge. It's not always supposed to be super difficult. It was carefully balanced so that every build will have rough patches and then sections where the player is left feeling like a god, as long as they understand how to properly use the mechanics they've chosen to interface with. This effectively means the player is truly allowed to experiment as they see fit, since nearly every option they have to choose from is valid. I hear a lot of people argue that most of the stuff that you can find in weapons categories and stuff are useless, and it's just a select few that are better. Well, it is technically true that there are optimal things in each category if you really know the meta. In reality, in terms of casual gameplay, nearly everything is extraordinarily useful if you just put time into it. That's important. There isn't really a weapon that's so underpowered that it's completely useless, including weapons like broken swords, which can later be turned into a super powerful sword. You might not want to use it on your way there, but you could. Anyway, importantly, just like Spelunky, Dark Souls can only rely on the player having a few select mechanics at their disposal. They can't ask the player to defeat a boss using only a bow. They can't make an enemy immune to everything but sorceries, and that's why the design of the game is such a miracle, because most other games that try this get it utterly wrong, particularly RPGs. They end up making enemies far too easy because you can deal with them with anything, and they don't try to tailor the difficulty around making certain options a little more difficult or a little bit more easy. It ends up being a mush where everything's way too viable and therefore it's all way too easy. Further strengthening the design is the fact that stats are treated more like a secondary part of the game. They're rarely the be-all end-all of success in Souls, rather they're usually situated as checks to make sure you can use weapons or spells and nothing else. This is important because it means the game doesn't rely on grinding for levels for a player to be successful. And actually, grinding a significant amount is really time consuming and difficult in order to prevent the players from wanting to overdo that and thinking that's the answer. You can beat Dark Souls at level 1 without too much more of an issue than if you made it all the way to level 100 by the end, as long as you understand how to use your options properly. Instead of most damage growth coming from leveling up, it usually comes purely through armor and weapon upgrades. That way, no matter your level, if you can upgrade your weapon, you can do more damage. To further refine the design of Demon Souls, healing is now primarily done through the Estus Flask, which refills when you rest at any bonfire. This means you're never left without healing at your disposal, unlike Demon Souls, where you can easily run out when you're a fresh player, forcing a grind or a restart. Combine this with player messages, bloodstains, the fact that co-op summoning still means opening yourself up to invaders, and the other previously established mechanics from Demon Souls, and you've got a game that completely understands how to synergize its core mechanics in a way that always gives players a pathway to success, and choices for how to fine-tune their personal difficulty. The benefit to the way Souls balances its combat and stats cannot be understated, and Dark Souls 1 in particular really takes advantage of this to provide the player an unthinkable amount of options for how to play the game. The fact that the game is so open at the start allows skilled players to work their way to a lot of particularly powerful rings, weapons, armor sets, etc., way before a new player taking the expected path would. But instead of breaking the game, this just gives said player a potential option for tackling the game in a different way. For example, most first-time players aren't going to be able to kill this Black Knight near the beginning when they come across it, but since I'm a seasoned player, I could take him out, meaning I had the chance for him to drop my favorite weapon in the game, the Black Knight sword. Luckily, he did decide to drop it, allowing me to completely alter how I handled the rest of the game by focusing on it. Suicide runs where players sprint toward particular items in the late game areas way before they can easily tackle the challenge there are also a common way to gain exotic and rare loot early. This really gives Dark Souls 1 an endless amount of replayability, which cannot be overstated. Dark Souls 1 also allows you to skip quite a bit of the game, meaning you're not forced to do everything to get to the end like in Demon Souls. The one potential major downside of the world design in this game is that it requires the player to do a fair amount of backtracking between areas, because you only get a limited fast travel option about 2/3 the way through the game. But personally, even after hundreds of hours of playing this game, it doesn't really bother me. Pre-bonfire warping, no area is more than maybe 2 minutes away as long as you're opening up the shortcuts the world offers, and post-bonfire warping, this more or less stays the same. Even though the amount of areas you can explore grows quite a bit, so do the points you can warp to. There's a ton more I could say about this game that glows with positivity, but let's be real, you've heard all of it already. Everyone has made videos about the often magnificent design in this game, from the beautifully natural level design to the hidden secrets everywhere, the varied bosses, the fantastic way it integrates both its theming and storytelling into the gameplay, the multiplayer options that are really unique. Let me say this up front. Dark Souls 1 is in most ways a masterclass of design, and even though it has issues, it is a masterpiece. The game improves upon Demon Souls in particular in a ton of ways, even if it's not always in the optimal way. For example, though the roll in Dark Souls 1 is only 4 ways still rather than being omnidirectional, this becomes a much smaller issue than it is in Demon Souls. Why? Because the game isn't obsessed with bottomless pits. So it's actually pretty rare for a failed roll to result in a death. They removed the backdash attack, which means the push, which is now a kick, is the only alternative strike that can get in the way of normal play, but it feels like they changed the response time for it as well, because the frequency of unintentional kicks is much lower than the push was in Demon Souls. Locking on is also much more consistent, accurate, and doesn't spend as much time staring at the ground. The input buffer system is also more consistent, and it even seems to offer the player better control when the performance tanks in the original version of DS1 than Demon Souls, where when it would drop frames, it would drop inputs constantly. The wider level design also fixes the problem with the enemy collision staying up for a bit after they die. The collision still stays solid during their death animations, but rarely is there not enough room to simply walk around them. And even when there isn't, the game never uses this as the crux of traps, unlike Demon Souls. This means if you end up in a situation where you get ganked because you can't move around a dying enemy, well, that's your fault. Finally, while you can't cancel wake-up animations in DS1, just like in Demon Souls, this time you're invincible until the frame where you're finally back in control. This means you can dodge roll the moment you become susceptible to damage now, preventing stun lock issues as long as you dodge intelligently, and mash that button to ensure it stays in the buffer. However, despite all these improvements upon Demon Souls, despite the amazing design Dark Souls 1 has, it's not perfect, and I see a lot fewer videos discussing the things it gets wrong than videos discussing what it gets right. So please keep in mind for the rest of the video that I love this game, and I think most of its design choices are astonishingly on point, but it does have a few issues worth mentioning that make it less than perfect. Some of these issues were fixed in the remaster, and some were not. For example, performance in the remaster, at least on every platform outside of the base Xbox One, is nearly perfect. When I first read a review of Dark Souls 1, I remember it mentioning how poorly Blighttown ran. Naturally, since I hadn't played a Souls game, and thought they were more generic Western RPGs, I didn't really see why that was a big deal. Who cares if one of the hub towns runs like junk? Well, Blighttown isn't a hub town, and it's one of the most dangerous early areas in the game. At this point, you can't even really call it a town, so much as a bunch of wood nailed together over a poison swamp. and it is hostile. And though personally I kind of like the charm of the place being so beyond saving that even the game struggles to deal with it, the sometimes single-digit performance of the original version is unacceptable. In the remaster, it's a silky smooth 60 frames a second. Many other areas buckled in the original game, which holds solid in the remaster. In fact, the only time I found drops was exactly where Digital Foundry did as well, whenever alpha textures and such like Sif's fur, the undead dragon's vomit, or Nito's cloak get really close to the camera. Outside of performance and some small quality of life improvements, like making it so that new items you pick up don't automatically get added to your quick select, there are a few graphical improvements in the game as well. Most are purely aesthetic, like parallax occlusion mapping on some surfaces, which effectively turns 2D textures into 3D geometry based off of baked-in data. But some of these graphical updates have gameplay benefits, like the fact that they toned down the bloom lighting in Izalith around the lava. This change translates to an area that, well, it arguably loses a bit of its visual flair, is infinitely more playable than it was before. Though it's not entirely a done deal, since they didn't alter the footstep sounds while trekking through lava, which were always equally as grating. Hearing this while exploring an area for a solid 30 minutes isn't exactly what I would call enjoyable. I'm not 100% sure, but it also feels like they improved some of the collision in a few areas. Regardless of whether they did or not, it still borders on unacceptable in areas like the Crystal Caves and the Great Hollow. Unfortunately, a few unintentional and unavoidable issues crop up in the remaster as well, that weren't in the original. The most obnoxious for me was the way invasions end up playing out now. When Dark Souls 1 originally came out, a lot of people didn't really know what they were doing. This means that even if you were invaded right after leaving the bonfire, you weren't guaranteed to die. Later on, as invaders got to intimately know the game and its systems, there were a lot less of them. This meant that if you did get invaded, you were probably in big trouble, but invasions were a lot less common than launch to balance it out. In the remaster, there are now tons of people playing, way more than the original had most likely, which means tons of invaders. Every single time I got invaded, it was under a minute after I left the bonfire, and every single time, it was a seasoned veteran waiting to destroy me. The fact that this game has such a thriving but old school fanbase means, at least in my experience, invasions are completely broken. They happen right away, and these people are always way better than you. As far as issues that exist in both versions of the game go, it's probably best to start with how poorly the game conveys information related to a lot of its systems. I appreciate that Souls is cryptic about a lot of things, but how basic stats work, what kindling and reverse hollowing mean, what poise is, how stat scaling works, these should not be left to the internet to explain. These should not be cryptic. And yes, if we're going to complain about how Dark Souls 2 handled adaptability, we should also criticize the series as a whole for how it handles basically every other vague system, which is a lot of them. Dark Souls 1 does a great job of telling players the basics of gameplay through the Undead Asylum area, using both natural design cues and direct messages on the floor, which mirror messages players can leave. But beyond that, nearly every other mechanic is obfuscated behind a lack of information. Similarly, some design choices don't hold up offline, because they're intended to be paired with player messages and bloodstains to be explored fully. Take the buttress you're expected to climb at the beginning of Anor Londo as an example. I wouldn't go so far as to say this is unfair when playing offline, particularly if there are hidden developer messages you can find using the Miracle Seek guidance, although you shouldn't be required to use it to continue, because it's an optional mechanic. But still, there isn't too much indicating that this is where you're supposed to be heading. And with the game being so open thus far, I'm sure many offline players assumed they needed to come back later after completing another area or something. This is realistically a problem that doesn't come up often, but still, if a game is going to be playable offline, it should accommodate offline play entirely. There's also one major area of what I would consider misleading conveyance, which is the direction you're supposed to head once you get to Firelink Shrine. The game really seems to be pushing you toward the graveyard that leads to the catacombs, with that large archway and everything. Meanwhile, the correct direction is a potentially difficult to spot stairway that leads around the cliffside. Others have mentioned how the game, most likely on accident, further pushed players to think that this was the right direction because skeletons are widely considered an early game enemy type in game design language. Toss in the fact that the marketing and the fanbase have given the game a reputation for being brutally hard, and a lot of players are probably led to believe the graveyard is the intended direction to head, even though it isn't. Moving on, as far as my playthrough goes, I had a few of what I would consider unfair deaths, seen here, and here. Some other enemies can feel cheap too, like the Hydras in Ash Lake and Dark Root Basin. They're not absolutely awful, but killing the last few heads can be brutally frustrating since they often don't come anywhere close to the player unless both you and them are sitting in just the right spots. The skeleton dogs in the Tomb of the Giants have a bit of a mismatch in their attacks as well. The problem is that there's not any major weakness in most of their common attack patterns. Their attacks have great range, are fairly frequent and swift, feel kind of chaotic, do large stamina damage, and can also do large amounts of normal damage. When you combine all of this, it's bad enough, but the fact that they're also in a dark area where they can come running out of nowhere, and your lock-on range is cut drastically even with the sunlight maggot lighting your way, together this makes them feel borderline unfair. They're still manageable, but only just, and only one at a time. The only other enemy I take just a bit of issue with is the secret boss of the DLC area, Calamite. Calamite has a head swipe attack which feels kind of unfair if you ask me. As I said earlier, proper design should mean that every build needs a way to avoid each attack from each enemy, even if some are more risky or difficult than others. As far as I can tell, a character that relies on rolls and doesn't use the Dark Wood Grain Ring can't consistently dodge this head swipe if they're within normal range. Dodge into the attack and you won't clip through his neck like you would many other attacks in the game, meaning it'll hit you. Dodge away and your iframes will likely run out before the attack is over, meaning it'll still hit you. I tried dodging this attack every which way and it always seemed to connect. Not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but still just a little bit annoying. I could be wrong and maybe there is a way to consistently roll out of it from a normal distance, but as far as I could tell, I couldn't find one. Meanwhile, while the camera in Dark Souls 1 isn't perfect, it's worlds better than it was in Demon Souls. This is mostly due to the way the environments are designed. A lot of Demon Souls was cramped and included enemies that forced you up against walls and such. At that point, the camera usually threw a fit, making proper play impossible, if it wasn't just looking at the ground the whole time. Dark Souls focuses a lot more on open areas, and even when areas are more enclosed, enemies seem to be smaller to fit, and the camera doesn't have near as many objects to get snagged on. Moving on to mechanics, there's really only one mechanic that I think needed some work, which is the equipment repairing system. Let's be real here, and admit that it doesn't really add anything to the game the way it is. Either you're forced to waste time repairing things regularly at each bonfire, or you risk forgetting if you choose to only repair occasionally, which can ruin an entire run through an area for no real reason if you suddenly get low because you forgot. There are a few basic attacks that can swiftly drain your equipment durability, but they're nowhere near common enough to make the system worthwhile. And finally, there are two areas in the game which I think really needed some work. Some might assume I'm talking about the Tomb of the Giants, but nope. I think that area is fine, honestly. The two areas which clearly have some major issues are Lost Izalith and the Crystal Caves. Both have good ideas in mind for gimmicks, but I think both struggle to succeed, as we know now due to time constraints. Firstly, the Crystal Caves, which focus on narrow, often angled crystal pathways, which then lead to completely invisible pathways you're required to traverse. To be fair, this area is easier than ever to traverse right now because so many people are playing. Not only are there tons of bloodstains and messages marking where invisible paths are, but actually watching the bloodstains instead of just using them as path markers is super effective for exploring the invisible paths. Even without them, there are crystal snowflakes that will fall from above. If they land and disappear, there's solid ground below. If they continue falling, that's where the platform ends. But this doesn't really feel like enough for those playing offline. And no, I don't really think expecting players to buy a bunch of prism shards is super fair. Though most players should find the area easy enough to traverse as long as they're not trying for any of the secrets. The invisible pathways only get complicated if you're trying to explore the side content. Though I always seem to forget where the final invisible path is on the intended pathway. Even this time I spent a good 20 minutes running around before seeing messages off in the distance that reminded me of where I'm supposed to go. The snowflakes just don't seem to be prominent on that one last path. And of course, we've already talked about how the collision here can be a mess. Something that's not really acceptable since it's often not totally in your control, and falling due to nonsensical collision never feels good. The other area that kinda sucks is Lost Izalith. The second half of the area is mostly fine, but the first half is torture. As already explained, it's really bright in the original, to the point where you can't really see anything. If you lose your souls in here, they're most likely gone. And equally as annoying is the constant sound of lava eating away at your character. But it has other issues too. There's only one type of enemy in the lava area of Izalith, which is essentially a giant dragon butt. They hit hard and they have janky hitboxes. They're absolutely everywhere and they're not really fun to fight. I think there's a reason they made these enemies able to hurt each other and made it so they don't respawn, because it's already borderline unplayable as it is. That was just a band-aid. If you had to kill each one individually, and if they respawned, this would be one of the worst areas I've ever played in a video game. Luckily, that half of Lost Izalith is skippable. Unluckily though, the latter half isn't. This part of the level isn't bad per se, though the collision on the routes gets in the way quite often. What's really the problem is the boss, Bed of Chaos. This boss is just luck, really. Similar to some of the bosses in Demon Souls, the biggest problem is that you can't look at the boss to see what attack it's doing while also seeing where you're going. And since the floor falls out from under you, you need to look where you're going. As such, most players will get ganked by swipe attacks constantly. If the massive damage they do doesn't kill you, the fact that these attacks almost always swipe you into one of the nearby holes in the ground will. The boss just attacks too frequently, and since most players won't ever learn any signs they can use to avoid said attacks, the whole thing just comes down to luck. Dark Souls Remastered is fantastic, all things considered. It has issues for sure, but for me, the things it does well more than make up for these problems. And there's so much I didn't talk about, including things like vagrants, which are these little enemies that can spawn in your world when other people drop items or lose soft humanity in their world. And the more worlds the good variant of the vagrants go to before being killed, the better the reward is. I found 3 across my playthrough, and was able to kill 2 of them, both an evil white phantom variant and an evil red phantom variant. Online functionality like that was insanely creative back when Dark Souls 1 first released, and it's still fairly unique today. Additions like this allowed Dark Souls 1 to change the industry forever when it released. People thought about everything from balance to combat design to online functionality completely differently after Dark Souls 1 caught on. There is no denying the enormous impact it had on games in general, and luckily the game is still more than playable all of these years later. Something I'm so glad I'm able to say. But what do you guys think? Have you played Dark Souls 1? What about the remaster? Has your opinion on it changed over time? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.